Hello everybody and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today I am delighted to welcome Andrew Lambert. Andrew is Lawton Professor of Naval History in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. His books include The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, and The British Way of War. Today he's launching his new book, No More Napoleons. So today, in our penultimate event of Waterloo Week, celebrating the 210th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, Andrew will discuss the impact Napoleon left on Anglo-European politics and how Britain worked to secure order in Europe. After this talk, I will be whisking Andrew upstairs to our shop where he will be signing copies of No More Napoleons. There will be time for questions at the end of this discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audiences, you can post questions in the Q&A chat bar and these will be put to the speaker at the end. In the room, I'll be bringing around a microphone, so just raise your hand. Moving on with some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please be gentle with us. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of the browser. A member of the team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I'm now going to hand you over to Andrew and begin the talk. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Amy. Audio check, it does work. Good. What I want to talk about today is contextualizing the Battle of Waterloo, which has an anniversary this week, but also contextualizing Britain's relationship with Europe across the long 19th century, not just from 1812, but a little earlier, down to 1914, asking some questions about why it is we privilege certain parts of our history, and how it is that so many diplomatic historians have managed to write the history of the 19th century without ever mentioning the development of British strategic capability. And so I will start with a fairly obvious discussion. The history of English-British relations with Northwest Europe in a strategic sense have always pivoted around what we now know as Belgium. It's had many other names. The port city of Antwerp is at the center of this. It's the industrial, economic heart of a very powerful region. It was also the key to the Scheldt estuary, the one body of water where a hostile power could collect an invasion fleet and plan an invasion of the British Isles. There are no other suitable harbors on the north coast of Europe for this task. So if you're going to invade England from the sea, in the age of sail, you will come through the Scheldt estuary. That is where the Spanish Armada was going to pick up its army. Duke of Parma's troops would move on to the Scheldt estuary to rendezvous. And that was why the Anglo-Spanish War of 1585 was declared by Spain when the British, English government put troops into key ports on the Scheldt estuary. One of these we know as Vlissingen. And this port would be important in the Napoleonic Wars as well. So the British-English garrison Vlissingen to stop the Spanish using the Scheldt as an invasion rendezvous, and that is the cause of war between the two powers. It has nothing to do with pirating in the Caribbean. That is romantic nonsense. It's great power that we're dealing with here. In 1793, the French Republic marches across what we would call the Belgian border, seizes the province, belongs to the Austrians, but they don't care much about it. It's a long way from Vienna. And the French incorporate Belgium into France. It becomes a French province, not part of conquered territory. They see Francophone southern Belgium as an obvious fit, and they will deal with northern Belgium as they go along. The opportunity to exclude the British from the trade of Europe is very attractive. The opportunity to take control of naval facilities and build up an invasion threat is even more attractive. This will be the central focus of British strategic operations for the entirety of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars. And any version of that story that doesn't mention these events is misleading. The map, I think, is very clear. Antwerp is here. Vlissingen is up here. This is the Scheldt estuary. And the forts on both sides of the Narrows are Dutch. The Dutch owned the control of the Scheldt estuary. They didn't own the estuary. So it was only when the French took over Holland as well, first by imposing one of Napoleon's brothers as king, and then by simply just running it. So as long as the French held Belgium and had access to the Scheldt estuary, Britain would be condemned to maintain a wartime military establishment, navy and army. This would be ruinously expensive. So the whole purpose of the end game of the Napoleonic Wars for the British is to stabilize Europe, exclude France from the Scheldt and Belgium, so that the British Army and Navy can be demobilized and the ruinous cost of a wartime establishment can be avoided, and Britain can start to do the thing that it always needs to do, which is to pay down the enormous national debt it has incurred in 20-odd years of full-scale conflict. The men who are overseeing this project are very clear about this. As soon as Napoleon marches into Russia, they are convinced he will lose, and this will change everything. They are preparing their game plan from early 1812 onwards. It's worth noting that Napoleon's army left from Boulogne, which was the place where he massed his troops to threaten an invasion. But you can't invade England from Boulogne. It's a dry harbour with very limited capacity. The invasion would always have come from the Scheldt estuary. The city of Antwerp, heavily fortified, was developed by Napoleon as a major naval base. If you've been to Antwerp, you will know the great docks on the right-hand side of this picture, which is now the home to the Antwerp Museum. On the opposite bank of the Scheldt is the shipyard where Napoleon built his new battle fleet. And this is a high-profile project. He made sure to capture his visits to Antwerp on canvas for display. So this is a first-class fortress. It has within it a major naval station and a major shipbuilding yard. This is the epicenter of British European concern. Lisbon is important. This is existential. Here we are, 1803, Napoleon and Josephine in Antwerp to inaugurate the new project. And he would go back to Antwerp on several occasions. This time, he's gone back with a new empress, because you have to change these things occasionally, I guess. And he is also there with his relations, the King and Queen of Westphalia, and they're launching the 80-gun battleship Le Friedland in memory of one of his many military victories. French warships are named after army victories. British warships are named after navy victories. You may think that's significant. It's the same artist, a very eminent Antwerp-based artist, Van Bray, who paints these spectacular images. But of course, with the fall of Napoleon's power in the Russian campaign, Prussia then joins. Napoleon is driven out of Central Europe. And as soon as it looks like Belgium will be liberated, the British send troops into the province. They can't capture Antwerp. They're not strong enough. They don't have enough firepower, but they are there. And when Napoleon abdicates in April 1814, Belgium, as we know it now, is an occupied province packed with British troops. This is also why the peace treaty with the Americans is signed in Ghent. It's a British garrison town. What immediately happens is that the Belgian artist paints a picture of British troops marching through the middle of Antwerp. It's a little on the gloomy side, but those are redcoats, and they're marching past the town hall. By taking Antwerp, the British are now in a position to develop their policy. What they want is the French out of Belgium. They want Antwerp neutralized. They want the Scheldt under the control of a power that will not threaten them. Their plan is really quite simple. They will unite Belgium, which the Austrians don't want back, with the Dutch Republic. But not liking republics, they will place it under the Prince of Orange, who will become the King of the United Netherlands. They will also marry the daughter of the Prince Regent to the heir of the Prince of Orange, setting up a dynastic link, rather like William and Mary a century earlier. This all sounds very Marlborough, doesn't it? Yeah, well, Marlborough turns up a bit later. These plans don't work particularly well. The marriage doesn't happen. In fact, the princess marries Leopold of Coburg, who will become the first king of an independent Belgium, but that's a separate story. But what the British do in the Vienna Congress process is to work all of their angles to make sure that everybody else agrees with their policy. For nobody else is Belgium an existential question. Once Napoleon has been removed, the French government is prepared to concede. The Austrians don't want it back, the Prussians couldn't care less, and it's a long way from Russia too. So the British make this their priority issue, and they secure those terms: a unified Netherlands, fortified borders, the forts to be put back up that were knocked down in the 1780s, and all of this to be under the control of Field Marshal the Duke of Wellington. And Wellington, as soon as the war ends, becomes the ambassador in Paris. He is also the commander of the British garrison in Belgium, and he will ride through Belgium, locating the new forts, and he will visit the famous battlefield in September 1814. He's familiar with it from Marlborough's notebook, because Marlborough approached Waterloo from the same angle as Napoleon and decided it was not a good place to fight a battle. Marlborough was much better at topography than Napoleon, much better. He outflanked the position instead in 1705. So Wellington is providing the strategic and even the tactical level guidance. The Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, is determined to remove all British forces from mainland Europe. And the Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, is the man who's enabling this at Vienna. But the problem of the economy is so great that Castlereagh doesn't stay to the end of the Vienna Congress process. He comes home to defend government policy on the economy in the House of Commons, because he's also the leader of the House of Commons. And he leaves the job at Vienna to Wellington. So Wellington signs the Vienna Congress for the British government. In September 1814, he conducts a tour of Belgium, including the battlefield, and he sets up an approach. The Prussian army has been brought all the way to Koblenz at the confluence of the Rhine and the Moselle, classic French invasion route into Germany. The Prussians start building a huge fortress on the hill behind Koblenz, the Ehrenbreitstein, and it's there in the garrison that Karl von Clausewitz starts writing Vom Kriege. These things are synergistic. Clausewitz, as you all know, was the chief of staff of Thielmann's corps during the Waterloo campaign and fought on the losing side at the Battle of Wavre. On the morning of the battle, Wellington at 9 o'clock is sitting on his horse on the high ground, looking down on the French army assembling, getting ready for the battle. And he gets some pen and paper out. He writes a note to the governor of Antwerp, British officer. He says, "Do not surrender the position. Open the water defences. Be aware there may be a flood of refugees coming up the road from Brussels." He sends a version of the same letter to the governor of Ostend, who is also a British officer. Wellington's concerns on the day of Waterloo have nothing to do with Brussels or Belgium. They are to do with strategic threat to Britain. Stopping the French acquiring access to the Scheldt is what this battle is all about. It is not about anything else. And Wellington knows this better than anybody. Wellington has chosen a battlefield where he really shouldn't be beaten. The French are going to have to come uphill and exhaust themselves before they enter combat. All he has to do is hang on until the Prussians turn up. And as we all know, he does this extremely capably. So we all remember the glory, the bloodshed, the chaos, the violence, the mistakes, and the odd human failings in this battle. But what we need to concentrate on is the geostrategic context. Wellington is no longer a general commanding an army. He is now a cabinet minister operating as both a tactical commander and a political director. His unique set of talents, which he's honed as ambassador in Paris, put him at the epicenter of this policy. And his name and his approach will be central to British thinking about this context for the rest of the century. Having won the Battle of Waterloo, Wellington becomes Master General of the Ordnance, and he is in charge of reducing army estimates. So the most famous soldier in Britain's job is actually cutting the army, reducing expenditure to deal with the overwhelming problem of debt burden. There's only three things you spend money on as a government in the early 19th century: army, navy, debt. If you stop paying your debt interest, your credit rating collapses and the interest goes up. You have to get on top of this. Liverpool is very keen on this, and so is Castlereagh. Liverpool, who always gets forgotten because he doesn't bother to go to Europe, is what we might call a Eurosceptic. He's not keen on being in Europe, in large part because he was in Paris during the Revolution. He was present at the storming of the Bastille and was well aware of what might happen if the passions of European states were unleashed. Wellington's job does not stop in 1815. By 1828, he is the Prime Minister. Liverpool has had a stroke and has died. Castlereagh's killed himself, and George Canning has just died as well. All the leading British statesmen have died. Only Wellington is still alive. And he takes on the job not because he wants to be Prime Minister, but because it's his duty to serve the King. He takes a very soldierly approach to this. He doesn't want the job, but he knows he has to do it because there is nobody else. What Wellington needs is to create the capacity for Britain to send a Waterloo-sized military force into Northwest Europe to secure the security of Belgium in partnership with the Prussians, the United Netherlands, and at distance Austria and Russia as well. This Wellington system would become ingrained in British thinking about war in Europe. In 1914, the British had such an army at their disposal. They just sent it to the wrong place because they'd completely misunderstood what Wellington was doing. The Wellington system was so well known that in 1840, at the height of the Muhammad Ali crisis, when France and Britain nearly went to war over Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, the French king mentioned crossing the Rhine and marching into Germany. At this point, the new king of Prussia awarded Wellington command of the Prussian army. It's all there in the diplomatic record. 2 weeks later, he backed down completely and the crisis went away. Wellington accepted the command, despite his relatively advanced age. And as he observed, had things turned out differently, he would have been in command of another rerun of the Waterloo campaign in the spring of 1841. So this is real business. It is critical to understand that. Wellington will spend all of his post-war career trying to build the reserve capacity of the British Army. Not the regular capacity, the reserve capacity. What he wants is to be able to take every single regular soldier out of the British Isles into Northwest Europe, probably Belgium, to defend Antwerp and the Scheldt. That means having a reliable, effective second or third line military formation. It proves impossible to keep the old militia up to date. There is no other system until September 1852, when in his last public act, Wellington brings a new militia bill through the House of Lords for final approval, which sets up a new militia of men who are paid to be in the militia, professional reserve soldiers. As a result of that bill, and Wellington died the next week, by 1854, the British Army can send a strike force of 25,000 regulars to the Crimea. This doesn't seem very relevant, does it? What are they doing in the Crimea? They are capturing and destroying one of Russia's major naval bases, which poses an existential strategic threat to Istanbul. That's what they're doing. And the synergy of that with Britain's interest in stopping France having dockyards and bases in the Scheldt estuary is perfect. So the main job of the British Army in the 19th century is dealing with naval threat. It's not big enough to be a continental army, but it is more than capable of doing that job. As a result, the intellectual elite of the British Army is the Royal Engineers. Their annual exercise is the capture and destruction of dockyards. And at Gillingham Barracks, they're able to do that because they're right next door to Chatham. So every year they knock down a bit of the defences of Chatham Dockyard and plan how to blow up naval infrastructure. Wellington understands all of this. He is also critically involved in the upgrading of British strategic architecture to enable the rapid movement of troops. We will come to that later. So the Anglo-German link forged at Waterloo would endure. When Wellington died, the great state funeral was held, and among the chief mourners were the Prussians, who came to check if the British were still up for coming back to Europe and helping them out against the French. A very serious piece of business. At the same time, the British needed to remind everyone that holding the Scheldt estuary was not the only desideratum. You would also need to command the sea. In April 1814, the Tsar of Russia held a review of his army of 120,000 men on the Champ de Mars in Paris. That's under the Eiffel Tower these days. He was very deliberately making a play to say, look at me, I am the master of the universe. My grandmother didn't name me Alexander for nothing. Immediately, the British government sets up a major naval review at Spithead and invites the Tsar, the King of Prussia, and others to come and see Britain's power on display. The Spithead Naval Review of late April 1814 is a fabulous event because it includes a grand tour of the dockyards, including the world's first manufacturing plant using interchangeable part assembly for complex items. That is rigging blocks. When you know there's 1,000 rigging blocks in the rigging of HMS Victory, you'll know how important it is to mass produce them. The Tsar was horrified, first by the size and scale of British power, secondly by the wealth on display, and third by the overwhelming technological superiority. He was also profoundly seasick. He found the gathering really very unpleasant. His ambitions to be the master of the universe were thwarted by a display of ships. Many of the ships on display were carefully chosen because they had the names of foreign vessels which had either been captured or had been named in honor of captured foreign vessels. One of the flagships was the Ville de Paris, named after de Grasse's flagship taken at the Battle of the Saints in 1782. So the British are making a complex statement. Before he leaves, he sails down the River Thames to Woolwich Dockyard, and the last thing he sees in Britain is the launch of HMS Nelson, the world's biggest battleship. He did not return to Britain ever again. The British have made their position clear. They have created a unified Netherlands, which should be strong enough. It proves in the Waterloo campaign to be so. And from that point on, the British look like they've got a fairly easy situation to manage. Of course, in 1830, the Belgians revolt against Dutch rule, and Wellington immediately launches a diplomatic process in London, which ends up as the Treaty of London of 1839, creating an independent, neutral, and guaranteed Belgian state. That's Britain's objective. Britain is intervening in European diplomacy to shape the strategic context, to make sure that if France marches into Belgium, the rest of the major powers will be on Britain's side to stop it. So keeping the French out of Belgium is the core of British policy, because the Scheldt estuary makes France a very dangerous competitor. Having lost access to the Scheldt, and post-Napoleonic French governments accepted that they couldn't have Belgium, the French governments that followed moved on to other projects. Napoleon had revived a grand project at Cherbourg. You're all familiar with Cherbourg, the world's second largest artificial harbour, even to this day. A monstrous project launched by Louis XVI to bolster the glory of the Bourbon regime. It became moribund under the Republic, but Napoleon revives it. It's going to create the world's largest anchorage for fleets, a first-class naval base, and it is literally 60 miles from Portsmouth. It couldn't be more obvious. Napoleon is only really getting going when he turns up in 1811. Again, poor old Marie-Louise saw quite a lot of dockyards, incomplete or otherwise. The British had known about the project from the 1780s. They were there when it inaugurated. But every succeeding French regime, and there were many after 1814, would put their effort into this, and they put their names on the structures that were completed. So we have the Bourbons, we have Napoleon, we have Louis XVIII, we have Charles X, we have Louis Philippe, we have Louis Napoleon III. They've all got a bit of this infrastructure to say, this is France, this is power, and we will take you on. The British are aware of this from the beginning. They keep a very close eye on it. The Royal Yacht Squadron is often in Cherbourg buying duty-free booze, and they give rides to Royal Navy officers who do a bit of recce work while they're there. The French know this. It's fairly common knowledge. The real response to this at this period is not necessarily particularly strategic. Before Cherbourg is anywhere near finished, the British have built a huge breakwater across Plymouth Harbour, which makes it much more effective as a place to blockade Cherbourg. That was finished in 1813. Cherbourg wasn't finished until the 1840s. But the real response from the British is cultural rather than strategic. J.M.W. Turner's great picture, Dido building Carthage, at the 1815 Royal Academy show in Somerset House. This is the picture of the show. It's huge. Turner painted it for the nation. It was never sold. He donated it and declared it should be hung where it still hangs, in the National Gallery. What is Turner telling us? Napoleon uses the term Carthaginian as a way of insulting the British. Shopkeepers, Carthaginians, and we all know how history turns out. There's a great war and the Romans win, and the French are the new Romans. Turner is saying, well, actually, this time we won, you lost. We are the masters of the universe now, and this is emblematic of where we are going. We are building our empire. And the stars of the picture are, to the left of center, it's a group of small boys playing with paper boats. They are the future captains of the Carthaginian navy. So Turner is telling us something very important. We do recognize the ancient world, but we're not the Romans. We are the Carthaginians, and we are the winners of this war. Almost immediately, the Royal Navy gets used to do a little bit of action quite close to Carthage. 1816, bombardment of Algiers. Small British battle fleet goes to Algiers to demand they stop enslaving Europeans, or white slavery, as we often call it, because some of those Europeans are under British protection, being Maltese or Sicilian. The Algerines don't give in very quickly, so Admiral Lord Exmouth destroys their fleet, most of their defences, and forces them to release all of their white slaves and pay a very large indemnity. Why did the British do this? Well, A, because they could, and secondly, because the alternative was the Russians turned up and did it, and the last thing the British wanted was the Russians in the Mediterranean. So this is the British using power to secure their strategic position. But the technology of attacking coastal fortresses is about to change radically. This is close range. Right in the middle of the picture, next to the huge flame, is HMS Queen Charlotte, which is the flagship. It's less than 50 paces from the main Algerian battery. It's overwhelmed it with rapid fire. By the 1840s, this job will be done by long-range artillery using precision fires. The British are finding new ways of solving the problem of hostile naval bases, which in the 18th century are almost invulnerable. In the 19th century, they will prove to be very vulnerable indeed. In the Anglo-American War of 1812, the British were using new weapon systems to bombard the American coast. This is the attack on Baltimore, and we're looking at mortar shells and rockets being used. You all know the lines from the American national anthem, the bombs in the air, the rockets' red glare. That's the Royal Navy bombarding Baltimore. It's a confession of weakness as well. Artillery was also being used, but artillery at this period is not particularly accurate and not especially long-ranged. Even a 32-pounder or 6-inch gun, it's not accurate beyond about 1,000 yards. That is all going to change. The guns that will be in service 20 years later look like they're the same guns, but they're not. They're much more accurate. 1830, HMS Excellent is established at Portsmouth. It's an old naval vessel which is going to be used for gunnery training for officers and ratings. The Royal Navy is professionalising firepower. Instead of just training the men to move the guns around, they're training them to hit targets. Thomas Hastings is a very interesting figure to run the establishment. He's a very scientific officer. He's capable in many sciences. But he was the first lieutenant of the frigate that took Napoleon to Elba in 1814. He listened to many of Napoleon's long, wandering, self-glorifying diatribes about the iniquities of the British and how close he had come to win. So he was well positioned to respond to what was going to happen. By 1840, the Royal Navy is engaged in the Muhammad Ali crisis, the Ottoman split with Egypt. And it ends up having to take out the great fortress at Acre. And it does so with a few Austrian and Ottoman vessels on board. But this is the first time the Royal Navy's new gunnery has been tested. The ranges are much longer, the precision of fire is vastly greater, and even the professional officers there are astonished how effective their precision fire is. They are literally knocking over individual cannon and killing individual gunners. This was about as good as smoothbore muzzle-loading cannon got. But the ambition is not just aimed at fortresses like Acre, manned by Egyptian gunners, it's aimed at French fortresses and Russian fortresses too. That ability is changing the balance of power between land and sea very effectively. At the same time, France is undergoing yet another new regime. 1830 revolution leads to the enthronement of Louis Philippe, who is now the democratic king of France, and his idea of joining the European body of nations is to open an immense gallery of battles at Versailles in which every country in the world is shown being defeated by the French. It starts with the Moors at the Battle of Roncesvalles, and it ends with a huge picture of a small cavalry raid led by one of his sons in Algeria. The picture is 12 meters long and 4 meters high, and it's a picture of nothing happening. This is the grand opening. The diplomatic corps of Europe is there to see what's going on, and many of the diplomats, of course, are veterans of the Napoleonic conflict. And what they are shown is pictures of their country being defeated by the French. So almost everybody who went was insulted. One of the British attendees, a very good friend of Wellington, Sir Herbert Taylor, observed of one picture that it was a picture of a French naval victory over the British. He said there wouldn't be enough walls in the world to hang every picture of the British defeating the French at sea. This is the picture he was talking about, Louis-Philippe Crépin's picture of the bayonets capturing the frigate ambuscade. It is a brilliant, brilliant piece of work, but it is celebrating something very, very rare. This is a French ship capturing a larger British warship. It is almost unprecedented and almost unrepeated. It's a very bold action. The French crash into the side of the ambuscade and capture it sword in hand by boarding. Napoleon commissioned this picture because it was so rare and hung it in his apartments in a way of saying that I hope someday we'll be able to do this for ourselves. But this is a very rare event. Crépin became the painter of the Marine to Louis Philippe towards the end of his career. The French have a huge history of military bombast on canvas, and among the more spectacular examples is Napoleon at the Battle of Eylau. 1807, frozen battle against the Prussians, the Russians in the snow. Men are dying of battle wounds, they're dying of hypothermia. The thing to notice is right beneath Napoleon's head, the horse's head, is an upturned figure of a man looking up who's clearly dead and frozen. We'll see him. When Turner painted the Battle of Trafalgar for George IV in 1825, he quoted that image. There is an upturned man looking out from the drowning sailors in the foreground of that picture. The sailors are there to replicate this image. There were no drowning sailors in the water at Trafalgar. Only an imbecile would get off a wooden ship into the sea. Wooden ships don't sink. So Turner is playing with Baron Gross's image. He's countering it. He's subverting it. Here is Napoleon as victor, redeemer, holy man. Napoleon chose the picture, as you might imagine. It's very big. It hangs right next to the raft of the Medusa. It's almost on the same scale. Here's the gallery of battles. It's still largely intact in the basements of Versailles. But Louis Philippe was overthrown in 1848. Like the other Bourbon regimes, the French people weren't interested in popular glory. They weren't interested in war. They were interested in lower taxes, political representation, and not sacrificing their sons to an aggressive war machine. The people who overthrow the Bourbons and Louis Philippe, they're Parisian working class people. They're not interested in war and glory. They're interested in much more prosaic things. So the French have missed the boat on this one. A lot of high art, but to no great purpose. 1850, Henry Chads takes over from Thomas Hastings on board HMS Excellent. He too has an interesting war. His ship was shot to pieces by a much larger American ship in 1812, and he too had learned the lesson about accurate gunnery. He will take this new accurate gunnery into the Crimean War. He's actually standing right behind the cannon in this picture. He's one of 4 admirals on the quarterdeck of a British cruiser firing at 3,500 yards, and they're putting rounds into the Russian fortress over and over again. This is precision gunnery of an order that was completely unanticipated in an earlier era. The gun has sights. The men who are serving it are fully trained. The officer directing the fire is also fully trained. And the 2 midshipmen at the top of the picture are spotting the fall of shot. So this is what scientific gunnery looks like. The fortress was captured with minimal casualties by accurate gunfire. It's a maritime position, so it very much is an analogue for what the British are planning to do at Cherbourg. The unusual thing is that one of the admirals is French, because the French are Britain's allies in the Crimean War. The following year, the great fortress of Cherbourg outside Helsinki is destroyed in a 48-hour continuous rocket, mortar, and shell bombardment. There are no casualties of a fatal nature on the Allied side at all. The Russians don't fire back after half an hour because their guns don't reach far enough to do any damage. The large flare in the background is the main magazine of the fortress blowing up. So this is a very impressive battle. The editor of the Times did observe that as nobody much got killed, in fact, nobody got killed, it didn't make the headlines. Yeah. Success without bloodshed is not apparently very interesting. Where is Wellington's strike force in the Crimean War? Well, of course, it's in the Crimea. What is it doing? It's doing this. It's captured Sevastopol, and it's spending 6 months blowing up the dockyard, every last piece of it. The British know all about Sevastopol dockyard because British engineers built it. Most of the dockyard machinery is British as well. What you need to see is right in the bottom of the dry dock, Royal Engineers are drilling down and putting charges under the base of the dry dock. And away there to your left are 2 French officers standing on the high ground, remembering that that's what the British planned to do to Cherbourg. So this is William Simpson celebrating what power looks like and what the Crimean War is really about. Remember, no British soldier was ever more than 8 hours' march from the sea at any stage in the entire Crimean War. It was an entirely maritime conflict, and the target was the base of the fleet that threatened to capture Istanbul. And that was the reason why the British were at Sevastopol. They weren't interested in Sevastopol, they were interested in the fleet it contained, which by this stage was all under the water. The war ends in early 1856 because the British threatened to do the same thing to St. Petersburg. And they then commemorate their victory in this war on St. George's Day by staging a Grand Fleet Review at Spithead, reviewed by the Queen. And they bring down the diplomatic corps from London and say, look at us. Here is a fleet that could destroy any of your coastal fortresses, take out your navy, and render you powerless. And after that, we'll break your economy. We won't march on your capital city because that's wasteful. We will destroy you economically, as we have just done to the Russians. The Russians and the Americans understood this very clearly. The French took a little longer. They were still thinking about other ways of doing business. Because, of course, no more Napoleons. Yes, there was Napoleon III, who overthrew the constitution, rather like Xi Jinping did, in 1852, declared himself emperor. Napoleon III, Napoleon's son, of course, had died without ever being proclaimed emperor. And the work on Cherbourg had continued. It was almost a litmus test of French authority to continue building this. But what they'd managed to build was something that was ideally suited to invading England around 1800. If you see the large breakwater in front of the position, the British know exactly how long that is, and that gives you a base to work out the targeting of establishments inside it. There's a lot of ships in the harbour, and with 200 gunboats, you can render it utterly unsafe to be there. The basins, facilities beyond it are in range of mortar fire in the 1850s. The French fleet isn't big enough to stop the British destroying this fort. But Louis Napoleon thought that this was his ace. So he summoned Victoria and Albert and the British to send a delegation in 1858, in August 1858, for a meeting which was intended to display the new dockyard, which was now finished, the new mainline rail link between Paris and Cherbourg, which was an obvious way of bringing troops up for cross-channel invasion, and a massive equestrian statue of Napoleon I on horseback pointing at Portsmouth. The royal party didn't attend the second two events. They just attended the naval jamboree. Louis Napoleon had the best of his Mediterranean fleet come around to pose as a serious threat, and the British sent a fleet of the same size. Here was the British fleet, photographed by the French star photographer Gustave Le Gray. British squadron at Cherbourg, August 1858. The ship on the far left is HMS Royal Albert, named after the Prince Consort. It is one of the two biggest ships on display. The other one is the French flagship Le Breton. Louis Napoleon's plan is this, that the British will come, they will see his majestic works, his mighty fleet, and they will agree to a French plan to reorganize Europe preemptively, which will suit French interests, not British interests. This will involve turning Italy into a three-state condominium in which the French can constantly interfere, and keeping Germany divided so that the French can use their influence and eventually re-establish some authority across the Rhine. The British are well aware of this. The Prime Minister sanctions the visit and makes sure that he doesn't go and the Foreign Secretary doesn't go either. So nothing is going to happen at this meeting. British politics would not allow that to be the case. 14th Earl of Derby is a very smart man, and he makes sure that this is going to be a waste of effort. And it's worse than that, because the British send Royal Engineer delegations, naval delegations, and they also give the French a very accurate chart of Cherbourg Harbour as a way of telling them that they know exactly where everything is, and they can measure to the inch how far things are from the gun positions outside the harbour. The Grand Jamboree is when Albert and Victoria board Le Breton, and they're meant to say, okay, we give in, we'll join you in this kind of liberal, progressive. And Albert has to explain to Louis Napoleon that the British don't do this. And he does so in German, because for both men, German is their first language. Louis Napoleon spoke French with a German accent. He grew up in German Switzerland. So Albert very clearly explains that the British are not prepared to preemptively change the map of Europe. They will respond to events. And by that he means if you invade Belgium, there's a war. Louis Napoleon is crestfallen, and after that, the end of his regime is inevitable. He's failed. He cannot get leverage for the program that would enable him to expand French borders and fulfill some of the boasts of the Museum at Versailles. When the British go back for another visit in 1867, Albert is dead, and the French Navy might as well be. The French naval challenge has evaporated. The same flagship is in the middle of the picture, but it's not a seagoing warship anymore. It's a drill ship. It's got no engines in it. It's going nowhere, a bit like the French Navy. They've run out of money. They've run out of impetus, and Louis Napoleon has been outmaneuvered by the British and the Prussians. And in 1870, we'll get the denouement of that event when the Franco-Prussian War breaks out. And this is the first major challenge to Wellington's Treaty of London. What is going to happen if the French or the Prussians, or both, cross the Belgian border? It's strategically an obvious thing to happen because it does occupy territory that will be very useful strategically to both sides. British Prime Minister William Gladstone mobilizes a 50,000-man strike force of Army and Royal Marines, mobilizes a fleet, and he sends a diplomatic demand to Paris and Berlin, and he says, if you cross the Belgian border, we are at war with you. We're not the allies of the other guys, we are just at war with you. We will uphold this treaty. The French and the Prussians do not cross the Belgian border. If you rattle forward to 2014, why didn't we send that message again? And if you wonder why, you need to realize that the official life of Gladstone contains all the information you need to work your way through this program. It was written by a cabinet minister in the government of 1914, John Morley. Everybody in the Liberal cabinet had read this book. Not one of them thought of exercising it. And just to make sure that Antwerp would be secure, the British built some new coastal service ironclads, HMS Cyclops. There are 4 of these, very powerful, small turret warships designed to reinforce the river defenses of Antwerp. Or if we're at war with the Russians, to attack Kronstadt. So the Royal Navy is ubiquitous. In 1861, the threat of naval action forced the Americans to back down over maritime rights at sea. In 1878, the threat of a fleet containing ships like this forced the Russians to back down over their attempt to seize and hold Istanbul. But the key question here is, why are there no more Napoleons in terms of this grand European imperial project? The answer, of course, in 1914, there is one. He's just called Wilhelm. He is a European ruler who wants to go beyond being a European significant figure to being a world significant figure. The German ambition to be a world power mirrors that of Napoleon. What does Napoleon say? He wants to conquer the world. Why? Because he wants to be Alexander the Great. All of this is made possible by some heroic engineering, and Wellington is heavily involved in building the great harbour at Dover. As you know, a lot of the harbour was filled in for commercial traffic, but it was built as a full-scale fleet anchorage for a steam and sail fleet in the 1840s. At the same time, the great anchorage at Portland was built, great harbour at Dunleary outside Dublin, and at Holyhead, greatly reinforced work at Harwich. What this means is the British can command their coastal waters with steam warships, and in the event of a war, they can escort their convoys on a daily basis from the Thames estuary all the way down to Plymouth, and then take them out into the wider Atlantic. They're reducing the risk of French commercial raiding, privateering. They're also reducing the risk of an invasion. But all intelligent British politicians know commerce warfare is far more likely than a full-scale invasion. France doesn't have the troops. If France is at war with Britain and Prussia, it cannot put 100,000 men on ships to invade England. And if they invade Belgium, they will be at war with Prussia. So these great harbours are part of a visionary project of the 1840s in which Wellington has a very large role, alongside senior naval officers, to upgrade Britain's strategic capacity. So you're creating a new reserve, you're making your field army deployable, you're maintaining naval superiority, you're increasing your infrastructure. You even build a serious naval base on the island of Alderney, which is only 20 miles from Cherbourg, just to keep an eye on what the French are doing. So while this period looks very quiet, and we think about the Crimean War as some kind of army operation, it's actually about global maritime command and about maintaining the ability to use that in peace and war. So in 1914, when the crisis brews up, British ministers are desperately looking for a way of not being involved in the war, and they forget the best way to not be involved in a war is to stop it happening in the first place. The 1870 strategy, based on Wellington's planning, should have been revived. In July 1914, the entire Royal Navy of modern warships is assembled in Portland Harbour. Every modern British warship. It outnumbers the German fleet by 2 to 1. The fleet should have been assembled, moved up the channel into the North Sea and pointed at Hamburg, Wilhelmshaven, or the Baltic, to concentrate the minds of the Germans and stress that this would not be a European war, it would be a global war, and that they would lose it very quickly. In the event, the Germans lost the First World War on the 8th of December 1914 off the Falkland Islands, when they lost their last significant strategic asset outside the European theatre. But instead, the politicians allowed themselves to be talked into sending their expeditionary force, which they had created at great expense and some political consequence in 1907, not to secure Antwerp, which was its purpose, but to join the French fighting line in the middle of France. It was not the job of the British Army to defend France against Germany. It was the job of the British Army to defend Britain's vital interests in northwest Europe, which were not the security of France, but the security of Antwerp and the Scheldt. This was a catastrophic error which led to the end of several centuries of not assembling mass conscript armies. Fundamental change in British identity. It also led to the only way that Britain could have lost the First World War, which is German attacks on British commercial shipping, operating out of Ostend and Zeebrugge. These should not have been in German hands and would not have been if Antwerp had been held. Nor, of course, would the German army have marched to Paris with an Anglo-Belgian army established in Antwerp. So the men of 1914 lost the plot. They hadn't done their homework. They didn't listen to the people who knew how these things should be done. Wellington would have been horrified. Thank you very much.